Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulullah wa ba'd. In our last few lessons, we talked about tafsir. What is tafsir? What is tafsir? And also its development and the literature, the vast literature that has been developed specifically for tafsir of the Qur'an or for the tools of tafsir, such as the various sciences of the Arabic language, grammar, balagha, the vast dictionary literature, the preservation of the poetry of the Arabs, the language of the Arabs from the time of revelation, as all of this was necessary for preserving the meaning of the Qur'an and enabling explanation of the meaning of the Qur'an. Now, with all of this discussion, and clearly it's obvious from what we've mentioned that Tafsir of the Qur'an is a major undertaking. It involves all of these sciences. So the question then that we want to address today is that in light of all of this, for the average Muslim, what is his relationship to the Qur'an and understanding the Qur'an and the meanings of the Qur'an? And before we begin with that, I want to just ask a question. How many of you have, at some point or another, heard this notion that understanding the Qur'an, studying the Qur'an, this is the task of scholars, and that the average person should stay away from this because you may misinterpret the Qur'an, you may misunderstand the Qur'an. How many have heard this notion before? Yes, this is something. I mean, certainly, I'm from Pakistan. You're from India. I know that at least where we've come from, this is a very predominant notion, and there are certain reasons behind it. You brothers weren't here in the previous discussions that we had, but tafsir is a major undertaking. It's a major undertaking. There's a tremendous deal of specialization that is involved in tafsir, mastering the Arabic language, mastering Arabic literature, mastering various aspects of the grammar of the Arabic language that you need to be able to precisely interpret the meanings of the Qur'an. So, from this perspective, there is, one might say, grounds for someone to make this sort of claim. But there's a problem with it, and we'll explore, inshallah, what exactly is the problem with this notion. For those of you who heard the first lessons, you will remember, as I mentioned, that when the Qur'an was first revealed to the Arabs, at the time of its revelation, and as the Qur'an describes itself, the Qur'an describes itself as Kitabun Mubin, a clear book, and as a bayan, as a clarification for mankind. So when the Qur'an was originally revealed, it was revealed to the Arabs, who at this time were not believers in the Qur'an, and it was revealed in their language, and like any text in any language, it will be intelligible to the reader who is a speaker of that, who is a native speaker of that language. And if it weren't, if it was all if it was all sort of a puzzle, a riddle, a mystery, then it would not be a very good text. Generally speaking, anytime you hear any speech, you read any text, it doesn't require explanation. There might be points that require explanation, but the meanings of the words should be self-evident, assuming that you have the basic level of knowledge necessary to understand that language. And we mentioned that an exception to this is, for example, when you have specialist texts. I might be a native speaker of the English language, but that doesn't mean that I can open up an English textbook on advanced physics or just like
Shakespeare.
Sure. Okay. Well, Shakespeare again. Shakespeare. The issue is that Shakespeare's English is not my native English. I'm separated from Shakespeare by 500 years. But in Shakespeare's time, the language that he used was, now it might have been very eloquently used, but the language he was using was understood by the people who were attending his plays. They weren't looking up commentaries to understand the plays that they were attending. Likewise, when the Qur'an was revealed, the Arab listener was not looking up commentaries to understand what does this mean. Yes, there will be times at which you might misunderstand something, even today, even with something that is relatively straightforward, even something that is in your language. There will be things that you don't understand. This is true. But the Qur'an is largely clear. Again, with those caveats that you have to know its language, etc. But the Qur'an is largely clear, not in need of explanation. And we talked about how the need for explanation arose from, as time passed, we move away from the context in which the Qur'an was revealed, and we also move away from the language in which the Qur'an was revealed. And so that all creates the need for explanation. But the Qur'an was revealed to be read and to be understood and to be guidance. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He begins the description of the Qur'an, He says, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. The very first description He gives is that it is guidance. And yet we have these people who go around telling Muslims that don't read the Qur'an, you may become misguided. There's a contradiction here, is there not? Don't read the Qur'an because you may become misguided. You may misunderstand it. You may go astray. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surat al-Isra, He says, إِنَّ هَذَا الْقُرْآنَ يَهْدِي لِلَّتِي هِيَ أَقْوَمُ. This Qur'an guides you, the reader, guides the people to that which is aqwam, that which is most upright, that which is best conduct, the best of ways. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says, يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسِ قَدْ جَاءَكُمْ بُرْهَانٌ مِّن رَبِّكُمْ وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكُمْ نُورًا مُبِينًا. O mankind, and now this addresses to all of mankind, it's not just Muslims. So even the kafir is being expected to read the Quran. For some reason we think that Muslims will read the Quran and go astray, but the kafir is being asked to read the Quran. Kafir is being asked to read the Quran and being told, قَدْ جَاءَكُمْ بُرْهَانٌ مِّن رَبِّكُمْ. A proof has come to you from your Lord. وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكُمْ نُورًا مُبِينًا. And we have sent down to you, a clear light. What's more, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surat Sad, He says, Kitabun, this is now He addresses the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, He says, Kitabun anzalnahu ilayka mubarak. This is a book which we have sent down to you, blessed, full of barakah, full of blessing. Incidentally, it's worth noting here that the Arabic expression used is anzalnahu ilayka, which we have sent down to you. When you translate it into English, and this comes back to something we discussed before about the importance of familiarity with the language and how that helps in understanding the meaning precisely. Allah says, Kitabun anzalnahu ilayka. In the English language, the word you is used for singular, it's used for plural, it's used for two people, it's used for any number. You, addressing an individual or addressing a group, two or more. In Arabic, you say anzalnahu, you say ilayka, to you. So this is singular. You can say ilaykuma, to you. This is now in the dual, because there's actually three cases in the Arabic language. You have singular, dual, and plural. So you could have ilaykuma, to the two of you, and you could have ilaykum, which is now plural. So just from reading the Arabic reader will automatically recognize that this is singular, this is dual, this is plural. That is something that gets lost in translation, because this is a feature not present in the Arabic language, in the English language. So that highlights something that we discussed before about the importance of understanding the language. But here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Kitabun anzalnahu ilayka mubarakun. Kitabun anzalnahu ilayka mubarakun. This is a book that we have sent down to you full of blessing, so that you can put it up on the shelf, so that you can carry it over the head of the bride and the groom as they walk out. No. Kitabun anzalnahu ilayka mubarakun liyadabbaru ayatihi wa liyatadhakkara ulul albab. Now this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying, this is why I sent it down. I sent it down to you, O Muhammad. Meaning Muhammad's job, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, is to deliver it. It's to deliver it, to convey it. But it's not just for him. لِيَدَّبَّرُوا, so that they, meaning mankind, those who are receiving the book, may reflect on its verses. لِيَدَّبَّرُوا آيَاتِهِ وَلِيَتَذَكَّرَ أُولُو الْأَلْبَابِ, and so that they may take heed, so that they may take lesson. وَلِيَتَذَكَّرَ أُولُو الْأَلْبَابِ, sorry, so that those who have intellect may take lesson from it, may take heed from it. Yatadhakkar actually comes from dhikr. Dhikr means to remember something. So remembering something means that you're aware of something and then you forgot it and now you're remembering it. And so the idea of what's meant by here by tadakkur is that when you read the Qur'an and you reflect on its meanings, it will remind you about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It will remind you of the obligations that He's placed on you. It will remind you of what is expected of you, so that you can wake up from your state of spiritual heedlessness. So this is the purpose for which the Qur'an has been sent down. This is what we are intended to do with it. This is not something that is just the scope of scholars. It's not limited to them. It's not just for them to engage in. This is for everyone to engage in. And note that it says, it makes this the purpose for which the Qur'an has been sent down, this verse. It says that this is the purpose for which it has been sent down. And what's more, it says that we are expected to take spiritual benefit, take lessons from it, take meaning from it, draw meaning for ourselves. And it's also interesting, this is وَلِيَتَذَكَّرَ أُولُو الْأَلْبَابِ. It's as if to say that the intelligent person, this is what he will do with it. The implication being that those who fail to do this are those who are unintelligent. And so, I think one lesson that we can take from this verse is that really one of the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to instill in us by revealing the Qur'an, and this is something that I think to a considerable extent is lost. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to, via the Qur'an, via study of the Qur'an, via reflection on the Qur'an, engaging with the Qur'an, He wants to create a community of believers who are fundamentally morally responsible beings. they take responsibility for their own spirituality, rather than allowing someone to act as an intermediary and spoon feed them everything. Because what that creates is that creates cults, where the cult member thinks, now this doesn't mean that everyone is equal now. It doesn't mean that the person who is a scholar of the Qur'an is the same as your average Joe off the street who barely knows anything about the Qur'an. That goes without saying, but that comes from his increase in knowledge. It's not because he has some sort of spiritual monopoly over his followers. And what happens is that when you discourage followers from learning, you create human beings who are not basically independent, rational, moral beings. They're entirely dependent on the leader of the cult, the leader of the group, that whatever he tells us is right, we're going to do. And people oftentimes wonder that these cults that come about and behave in crazy fashion, and why do they do that? And part of it is there's a psychological aspect that human beings have a spiritual void that needs to be filled. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, part of filling that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed the Qur'an. That we read the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Himself. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses us Himself. And we mentioned this in one of the previous talks, that one of the things that people will oftentimes note about the Qur'an is that when you read the Qur'an, you will oftentimes feel, you may have read a verse many times and then you will read it, and at that moment, that particular reading, you will feel it's as if in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is speaking directly to me. Anyone who has experience reading the Qur'an has had this experience. Because it is revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who knows His creation. So nothing can fill that spiritual void better than that. But when you don't have that, you go looking for it somewhere else. And so sometimes what happens is people, they become religious and they're looking for filling that void, and because they have not developed a foundation, a spiritual and moral foundation of their own that allows them to be discerning individuals, that they can hear what different people are saying and say, you know what, this is just not right. They don't have that capacity. And so when the cult leader says that this person is a blasphemer, this person is this person is that, go out and kill him, you'll find these mobs are ready to go out and kill people, and they're not even sure why they're killing them. This mentality, where does it come from? It comes from the lack of this sort of moral base where a person is able to discern right from wrong for himself. And another problem that it creates is that people will engage in immoral behaviors feeling that it's justified. Why? Because I have a fatwa. If the person were honestly to ask himself, as the Prophet ﷺ said in the hadith, "Istafti qalbak wa naftaka al-muftuna wa aftok." Consult your heart. The hadith basically says, seek fatwa from your heart, even if the muftis give you fatwa after fatwa. It doesn't. Again, I don't want anyone to misunderstand me. There are a host of issues that require specialist knowledge, and you should consult people who are specialists for that. That is not the point. But the point of this hadith is that when someone gives you a shady fatwa, someone gives you a fatwa justifying or rationalizing what you deep down inside know to be immoral behavior, or at least you understand the fatwa, because sometimes maybe that's not really what the fatwa is saying, but then people will get a fatwa For example, a fatwa might, the mufti might say that this is a valid contract. Now you might have committed sin in achieving that contract, but the conditions of the contract are met, and so therefore it's a valid contract. So the person takes that, so oftentimes what happens, and again this comes from people not having that moral compass. What happens is that they'll take this fatwa and say, well, if the contract is valid, then my this behavior that I'm engaging in is okay. So, for example, I've mentioned this as an example. What you have is someone gets married in secret, takes a second wife. Now, he doesn't want the first wife to know. So what does he do? He starts lying. Now, if he stops lying, his wife will discover. So what happens is he continues lying. Eventually, his whole life turns into a lie. He's constantly lying. He's lying to his wife, he's lying to his children, he's lying to his parents, he's lying to his neighbors. He's just lying through his teeth. But the marriage contract is valid. So he thinks that what I'm doing is fine. Even though the Prophet ﷺ said, firstly Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Qur'an, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu ittaqullaha wa kunu ma'as sadiqin. O you who believe, fear Allah and be with those who are truthful. Don't just be a truthful person, be deep amongst the ranks of the truthful. Then the Prophet ﷺ in a hadith he says, إن الرجل لا يصدق ويتحرى الصدق حتى يكتب إن الصدق لا يهدي إلى البر وإن البر لا يهدي إلى الجنة وإن الرجل لا يصدق ويتحرى الصدق حتى يكتب عند الله صديقا. Sidq, truthfulness, honesty, leads to righteousness. Righteousness leads to Jannah. A person will speak the truth and strive in being truthful until he will be written with Allah as a Siddiq. And then the other side, the Prophet ﷺ says, وَإِنَّ الْكَذِبْ لَيَهْدِي إِلَى الْفُجُورِ وَإِنَّ الْفُجُورَ لَيَهْدِي إِلَى النَّارِ وَإِنَّ الرَّجُلَ لَيَكْذِبْ وَيَتَحَرَّى الْكَذِبْ حَتَّى يُكْتَبُ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ كَذَّابًا. And a person, he says that lying, dishonesty leads to wickedness, fujur. And wickedness leads you to the hellfire. And a person will lie and carry on lying until he is written with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his record as a liar. The Prophet ﷺ, when he started his message, when he started his preaching in Makkah, before most of the ahkam were revealed, before khamar was haram, before the details of the salah and the zakah and the hajj and all these things had been revealed, before they had been legislated, one of the major things that the mushrikeen knew about the Prophet ﷺ and that the Muslims knew about the Prophet ﷺ, what does he command you to do? He says, worship Allah alone, be chaste, be generous, be honest. Sidq al-hadith. From the very beginning, one of the fundamental foundations. The mushrikeen recognize that this is what Muhammad ﷺ is teaching us. When Muslims get disconnected from the Qur'an, when they lose that moral compass, they themselves lose sight of that. Because you'll find that this person is who, in the scenario that I described, he might be praying in the masjid, doing lots of good, beard like this. As far as he's concerned, he's a very religious person. And he genuinely tries to be a very religious person. But because he doesn't have his own moral compass, his standards are backwards. And so, وَلِتَذَكَّرَ أُولُو الْأَلْبَابِ. The Qur'an is intended to make us ulul albab. It's intended to make us believers who know where their moral compass is. You don't have to be an expert in fiqh. You don't have to be an expert in the Arabic language. You don't have to be have mastered the intricacies of Arabic grammar to know that Allah does not like it if you lie and cheat and steal. This should be something that is self-evident. And so this is a big part of why the Quran has been revealed for all of us. And one of the amazing things about the Quran is that Aslan, the Quran, when it was revealed, the Arabs were illiterate. Many of the first Sahaba to memorize the Quran were illiterate. There was no hierarchy in the sense of, I'm the beach sahab and come and give bay'ah to me and just shut your mind off. These illiterate people were learning the Quran, memorizing whatever they could memorize. Some of them memorizing a few surahs, some of them memorizing more. And as the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَرْفَعُ بِهَذَا الْكِتَابِ أَقْوَامًا وَيَضَعُ بِهِ آخَرِينَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala raises up some people by means of this book, and He brings others down. So the Quran was revealed for us to reflect on it. In this vein, there are a couple of other verses that also mention the Tadabbur of the Quran. Allah says in Surat Muhammad, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أَمْ عَلَىٰ قُلُوبٍ أَقْفَالُهَا. This verse is actually referring to the munafiqeen. Do they not reflect on the Quran, or are there locks on their hearts? And in another verse, also speaking about the munafiqeen, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ وَلَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. These people who are doubting and questioning the truthfulness of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, do they not reflect on the Quran? If it was from other than Allah, they would have found it full of contradictions, full of inconsistencies, full of irrationality. There would have been problems in it, because no one can write a book that is perfect as a human being. Only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can reveal a book that is perfect. So reflect on it and see, is it from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or not? And one thing that is interesting about this is that we know from observation that people read the Quran and they become convinced that this is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they accept Islam. Are the scholars? Have they studied 10, 20 years in a madrasa or university or something? No. In fact, for the most part, they're not even reading the Quran, they're reading translation of the Quran. Even reading a good translation of the Quran, you can reflect on it to a point that you reach the conclusion that this is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this notion that you shouldn't read the Quran, it will send you astray. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us explicitly that this Quran will guide you. And we have people who want to tell us that be careful of reading the Quran for yourself because it will misguide you. No, it will not misguide you unless you are seeking misguidance. If you seek guidance from the Quran, you will find it there. So, this idea of reflection, the wordings that are the wording that is used here in these verses is the term is Tadabbur. Tadabbur. The Arabic term is Tadabbur. And Tadabbur in the Arabic language, it means to look at the outcome of something. So it's not So when we speak about reflecting on the meanings of the Quran, Tadabbur, it's not just, I've read this verse, these words mean this. It is the layer of meaning that is beyond that. And this could be simply just in reflecting on yourself. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, all praise is due to Allah, Lord of the worlds. Reflecting on all the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that in the universe that He has created, and appreciating that He is worthy of praise for them, that is tadabbur. That is reflection. And that will increase your iman. And it doesn't require you to be an expert in tafsir. So, there is obviously a level of tadabbur that not everyone will be able to do, because it requires a certain level of knowledge that is not available to everyone. But each person, according to his own capability, is capable of engaging with the Qur'an. And based on that person's ability and sincerity and intent and effort will determine how much he draws from the Qur'an. Not everyone will draw the same thing from the Qur'an, but everyone as a Muslim is intended to have a relationship with the Qur'an. Because remember, for example, when the Prophet ﷺ, when he taught the Sahaba that there's 10 hasanas for every harf that you recite. He said, I don't mean alif lam mim is a harf, alif is a harf, lam is a harf, mim is a harf. For every harf. He was speaking to people who knew the Arabic language. So when they read it, they knew what they were reading. So all that was left was for him to encourage them to read it as much as possible. Now, that doesn't mean that a person who reads the Qur'an, for example, if I read Surat al-Baqarah and I don't know the Arabic language, I don't know the tafsir of the surah, I read Surat al-Baqarah. Surat al-Baqarah obviously is 286 verses, so many words, so many letters. Obviously, there will be tremendous reward for that. I'm not denying that a person who reads Surat al-Baqarah, for example, and people are saying that they're not able to hear. 7:53. Yeah, is everyone able to hear now? Okay. Yeah, so I'm not denying that the person who reads the Qur'an, who reads Surah Al-Baqarah, for example, even if he doesn't understand what he's reading, that he will get reward for that. But he will not be, by doing so, fulfilling the purpose. That in and of itself will not fulfill the purpose for which the Qur'an has been sent down. So it's very important that we understand that, yes, we want to recite the Qur'an, but we want to understand the Qur'an, we want to take lesson from the Qur'an. As this is the purpose for which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us He has sent it down. He has sent it down to be guidance. And if you're not seeking guidance from it, it will not guide you. Because it came down to the Quraysh, and there was no one more capable of understanding it than they were. But those who chose not to seek guidance from it did not receive any guidance, and they died at Uhud and at Badr and these other battles, fighting against the Prophet ﷺ, and went to Jahannam. Abu Lahab, the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, went to Jahannam. Not because he didn't recognize the character of his nephew, not because he was incapable of recognizing the guidance that is there in the Qur'an. He was more capable of it than most of the Mufassirin are today. But he was incapable of it because he was unwilling to overcome his ego. And so, if a person is humble and seeking guidance from the Qur'an, and also recognizing his limits, you have to recognize your limits, that if you're not capable of doing tafsir of the Qur'an, then you should not be challenging those who are. and saying, no, I think that actually this verse means this. And all of these mufassirin through the centuries, they didn't know what they were talking about. I've read the English translation and I've decided it means this. You should know your limits. So, but if you know your limits and you're sincere and you're seeking guidance from the Quran will be a guidance for you, because that is why Allah sent it down. So this basically is the foundation of what our relationship with the Quran should be. Now I want to talk a little bit about what is the relationship between tafsir and tadabbur. Tafsir, as we said before, is basically explaining what does the Quran mean. What does the Quran mean? So you read a verse and you say, what does this mean? And tadabbur is, okay, now that I know what this means, let me reflect on these meanings. And this process of reflection may help you to discover additional meanings that are not immediate. Or it may help you to discover, to draw lessons that are not necessarily explanation of the meanings, but they are lessons that for you to internalize and to put into action. So this is tafsir and this is tadabbur. What I want to do is actually take a look at a sort of, I guess you could say, practical example where we can see what is tafsir and what is tadabbur, looking at actual verses of the Quran. All of you will be familiar with Surat al-Kawthar. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed Surat al-Kawthar. Inna a'tainaka al-Kawthar fasalli li rabbika wanhar inna shani'aka huwa al-abtar. So, Surat al-Kawthar, the translation of the first verse, Inna a'tainaka al-Kawthar. Inna, indeed, this is the word inna, with the na, which is a pronoun meaning we. Indeed, we, a'tainaka, we have given you, and this you here is again singular, as we said. The kaf, when it comes by itself, is singular. We have given you, O Muhammad, al-Kawthar. So inna, we, knowing that the we here is referring to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is part of the tafsir. Knowing a'tainaka, that the you that is being addressed here is Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this is also part of the tafsir. And al-Kawthar, what does al-Kawthar mean? Al-Kawthar, as probably most of you are familiar, Al-Kawthar is the name of a river in Jannah that the Prophet ﷺ has been given. But what you might be unfamiliar with, and this is where the role of tafsir really comes in, really kicks in, is that there's in fact different interpretations of this verse. So one interpretation is that Al-Kawthar is a river in Jannah. There is another interpretation, and to clarify what that interpretation is, let me first explain that linguistically the word Kawthar in the Arabic language means khayrun kathir, abundant, boundless good. So some mufassirin have said that this verse means, indeed we have given you, O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this river in Jannah called Al-Kawthar. Another interpretation is that indeed we have given you, O Muhammad, abundant good of every kind, starting with prophethood. It's obviously the pinnacle of what any human being can be given. Revelation, guidance, if you also consider the Prophet ﷺ in comparison with the previous nations and the previous prophets, that his nation was made the largest of all believing nations. And he was the first prophet who was sent, and the only prophet to be sent to all of mankind. Previous prophets were sent each individually to his own nation. And the high status that he has been given in the hereafter, higher than what any other human being, any other creation, any other prophet has been given. His nation will be the first to enter Jannah of all the nations, and so forth. So they say that al-khair al-kathir, abundant good, it encompasses all of these things. And so this first interpretation that Al-Kawthar is a river in Jannah is coming from a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, in which he says, do you know what is Al-Kawthar? The surah is revealed to him, and he recites it, and he says to them, do you know what is Al-Kawthar? And say, Allahu wa Rasuluhu a'lam. Or I'm not sure the exact wording of the hadith offhand, but he says to them that they said, Allah knows best. We don't know the meaning. We don't know what is Al-Kawthar. So he says, Al-Kawthar is a river in Jannah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given. And it has been described in various authentic hadiths. For example, Aisha radiallahu anha, she reports, as is mentioned in Sahih al-Bukhari, that the banks of the river are made of hollowed pearl. And there are other narrations that describe it, saying that the riverbed, rather than dirt, rather than soil, is musk. And so it's something beyond anything that we can imagine here in the world. This is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given the Prophet ﷺ in the hereafter. She also, in that same hadith, she mentions that the cups or the vessels for drinking, for taking water from Kawthar that are lining its banks are as numerous as the stars in the sky. So it's a very vast, very long river, very, very large river, unlike anything that we can conceive of here in the world. So this is how it's been described, and the Prophet ﷺ in this hadith is very clearly saying that Al-Kawthar is this. As a result of which, a number of Mufassirin have said that this is the meaning of Al-Kawthar. Some Mufassirin looked at the linguistic meaning of the word Kawthar, and they said that this is general and it encompasses all of the good things that the Prophet ﷺ has been given. And so one time, Sa'id ibn Jubair is a student of Abdullah ibn Abbas, the companion of the Prophet ﷺ. Sa'id ibn Jubair was once, he gave this tafsir, and someone asked him, said, is it not the case that Al-Kawthar is a river in Jannah? And so Sa'id responded, he said that river is from the abundant good that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to the Prophet. And so essentially what Sa'id has done here is he has reconciled these two different opinions, one that looks at the linguistic derivation of the word and its linguistic meaning, and the other one that is looking at this hadith of the Prophet ﷺ and says that yes, that is something that the Prophet ﷺ has been given, and it is called Al-Kawthar because it is one form of boundless good that the Prophet ﷺ has been given, but it is not the only one. So this is now tafsir, these different opinions, these different interpretations. What is it referring to? A'tainaka, who is this you that is being referred to, and then different approaches to interpreting Al-Kawthar. And what I've given you is actually a simplified summary of the discussions on what does Al-Kawthar mean, because there's actually a lot more that is mentioned when you read in the books of tafsir about what does Al-Kawthar mean, particularly the more detailed works. But this is essentially the summary and the essence of it. So this is all here so far tafsir. Basically, now we know what does this mean. So tafsir answers the question of what does this mean. Now, having understood these meanings, reflecting on them a little bit further will lead us to additional meanings. So that reflection overlaps with tafsir. And then it can also lead us to reflections that are not really meanings of the verse per se, and so would not be categorized as tafsir. So there is an overlap between what is called tafsir and what is called tadabbur, but they are not the same. So we have, for example, one of the reflections is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says here, Inna a'tainaka, using the plural. He could have said, Inni a'taituka, I gave you. Indeed, I have given you. It says, indeed, we have given you. And so, this usage of the plural, or what in English might sometimes be called the royal we, is an indication of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's greatness. And the reason that this expression is being used, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sometimes in the Qur'an refers to himself in the singular. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I did not create jinn and men except to worship me. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have said, we did not create. وَمَا خَلَقْنَا الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have used the plural there, but he used the singular. But here he has used the plural. And so on reflecting on this, and this also overlaps with balagha, which is the linguistic study of the verses to understand why certain things have been expressed in certain ways. Allah says, Inna a'tainaka. So this is an indication of the great maqam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the purpose of this is that this verse is intended to show ta'zeem of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so when you realize the great maqam of the one who is giving this, and then you realize the greatness of what has been given, this leads you to realize the greatness of the maqam, the status of the one to whom it has been given to. And so this is fundamentally a fundamental part of the intent of the verse. So this might be a secondary layer of meaning that is not immediately obvious necessarily. It requires a little bit of reflection. But it is fundamental to what was intended by this verse. So in that sense, it is part of tafsir, and it is also part of tadabbur. Some of you may be familiar that part of the reason why this surah was revealed, Inna shaniyaka huwal abtar, the one who despises you is the one who is cut off. He is the one whose mention will come to an end, whose memory will be forgotten. Abtar in the Arabic language means for something to be cut off. It literally means for a body part to be cut off. And so it's oftentimes used, for example, for an animal like a donkey or something that has lost its tail. It's called abtar. So it literally means for something to be cut off. But the Arabs oftentimes use this expression abtar to refer to someone who had no male offspring. Because for the Arabs in Jahiliyyah, your memory was dependent, your legacy was dependent on your male offspring. And this was a very big part of the culture of the Arabs before Islam, particularly because there was a great deal of value attached to male children, because male children were the ones who provided you financial support, military support. They were the ones who gave you strength and status and wealth. This was something that was very important for them. And then that was what carried on your legacy. And this was something that the Arabs themselves gave great importance to. to the point that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Baqarah, when speaking about Hajj, He says, فَإِذَا قَضَيْتُم مَنَاسِكَكُمْ فَاذْكُرُوا اللَّهَ كَذِكْرِكُمْ آبَاءَكُمْ أَوْ أَشَدَّ ذِكْرًا. When you finish the manasik of Hajj, when you finish the rituals of Hajj, then mention Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala like you used to mention your fathers. Or أَشَدَّ ذِكْرًا, or even greater than that. Obviously, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is worthy of greater than that. But this is in reference to something that was a practice of the Arabs, that they used to take great pride in their forefathers and the things that they had done, and boasting about them to one another. And so this was how their legacy would live on. And so when Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as you know, his only offspring who lived beyond childhood were all daughters. He had a couple of sons, but they died, all of them, in infancy or at a very young age. And so when his sons died, some of the chiefs of Quraysh, they said, referred to Muhammad as Abtar, that don't worry about him, his legacy will not last beyond his lifetime. He has no sons. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that the one who hates you, he is the one whose legacy will not last. Because who remembers now Abu Jahl? Who remembers now Abu Lahab? Who remembers now Al-As bin Wa'il, about whom this verse is said to have been revealed? Who now remembers Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul? Who now remembers the chiefs of the Jews of Medina? The only one who remembers them now is Muslims, who, if we remember them to curse them. This is their only legacy. They have no legacy. Whereas, look at the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as Imam al-Zamakhshari, as he puts it, he says, "Huwa al-abtar la ant." He is the one who hates you. He is the one who will be cut off, not you. This huwa al-abtar, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have worded the verse, "Inna shani'aka al-abtar." The one who hates you is the one cut off. But to emphasize it, he says, the one who hates you, huwa al-abtar. He is the one who will be cut off. La ant, not you. Not you, O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. لأن كل من يولد إلى يوم القيامة من المؤمنين فهم أولادك وأعقابك. Because all the believers who will be born until Yawm al-Qiyamah, they are your offspring and they are your inheritors. وذكرك مرفوع على المنابر والمنائر. And your mention has been raised, your name is mentioned from every minbar and from every minara when the adhan is called and when the khutbah is given and when the salah is read. In tashahhud, all of us, we read Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad. وعلى لسان كل عالم وذاكر إلى آخر الدهر. And on the tongue of every scholar and every person doing dhikr until the end of time. يبدأ بذكر الله ويثنى بذكرك. First they mention Allah and then they mention you. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. وَلَكَ فِي الْآخِرَةِ مَا لَا يَدْخُلُ تَحْتَ الْوَصْفِ. And as for what is in store for you in the akhirah, then it is beyond description. فَمِثْلُكَ لَا يُقَالُ لَهُ أَبْتَرٌ. So it's not conceivable that you could be described as abtar. وَإِنَّمَا الْأَبْتَرُ هُوَ شَانِئُكَ الْمَنْسِيُّ فِي الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ. The abtar, the one whose legacy is cut off, who has no legacy to leave behind, whose memory will be forgotten. It is the one who is forgotten in the dunya and in the akhirah. وَإِن ذُكِرَ ذُكِرَ بِاللَّعْنِ. And if anyone remembers him, they remember him to curse him. And so he goes on and he mentions, Imam al-Zamakhshari, he mentions, كانوا يقولون إن they used to say this about Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they would say إذا مات مات ذكره. When he dies, his memory will die with him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the purpose here in this first verse, coming back to why I mentioned all this, coming back to the first verse, that this is the context in which this surah is revealed. This verse was revealed to comfort the Prophet ﷺ, to assure the Prophet ﷺ, to strengthen the Prophet ﷺ, that what we have given you is far greater than what they're talking about. Yes, you may not have a male offspring. But in spite of him not having a male offspring, just consider his lineage that survives through Fatima radiallahu anha have spread through the earth. They're literally in the millions. And there's in the Muslim world, there is no lineage that is considered a more noble lineage than this, even though it is through his daughter and not through male offspring. But that aside, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling him here that you may not have male offspring, but what you've been given is far greater than that. Battery is running low. No. That's fine, so we're almost done. So, this is also part of the Tadabbur, but you could say that it's part of the Tafsir as well, because understanding that this is the purpose for which the verse was revealed, these purposes, to show the great maqam of the Prophet ﷺ, and to show and to comfort the Prophet ﷺ, is part of understanding the meanings that that these verses were intended to be revealed for these meanings. Continuing on with the Tadabbur, we can also draw lessons or guidance from these verses that are not necessarily explanation of what does the verse mean, but they are lessons or guidance that can be taken from the verse. So for example, from the vantage point of our Iman, it is part of Iman to believe in Al-Kawthar, that there is this great river in Jannah, and that we should want to know about it, and some of the things that have been mentioned about it. So for example, the person who drinks from Al-Kawthar will never feel thirst again after. So in Yawm al-Qiyamah, everyone will come thirsty. The sun is over their heads, and they will if they're blessed to drink from Al-Kawthar, they will never feel thirst ever again. So knowing this and realizing all of this and wanting to know these details about Al-Kawthar because of the great status it has, this is part of our Iman. Also part of our Iman is realizing the great status of the Prophet ﷺ. What does this lead to? This leads us to wanting to follow his example. When you realize the great maqam that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given the Prophet ﷺ, this is motivation to then follow his example. Likewise, one lesson that we can draw from the surah is here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala defends the Prophet ﷺ against those who have attacked him by showing and explaining his virtue and his true maqam. And so just as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has done that here in Surah Al-Kawthar, one of the lessons that we can take away is that when people are attacking the Prophet ﷺ, one of the best ways to defend him is to show his greatness and to make it known and to explain to people the virtues of the Prophet ﷺ and the great qualities that he possessed. That is that's not now here, that's clearly not tafsir of the verse. The verse is not saying this. This is not the meaning of the verse. But it is a lesson that can be taken from the verse on reflection. When you reflect about the greatness of the Prophet ﷺ, the great status of the Prophet ﷺ, when you reflect on the fact that he is worthy of being followed, and then you begin reflecting on am I truly a follower of the Prophet ﷺ? This is all reflection. This is all tadabbur. What can I do to better follow the Prophet ﷺ? This is reflection. This is tadabbur. This is a lesson that you need and that you can take from these verses. But it's not tafsir. So there is an overlap between tafsir and tadabbur, but they're not the same. And in case we'll conclude with that. Inshallah, with our next lessons, whenever those will be, because Ramadan is coming now, I'm thinking, inshallah, we will start with actually looking at the tafsir of Surat al-Fatiha. And after that, either we can move on to Surat al-Baqarah or consider doing some other short surahs. But we will conclude with this for now and possibly pick up after Ramadan. Inshallah, we'll discuss in the group what exactly we are going to do. So until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Subhanakallah wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, you can ask your questions. Okay, that's an interesting question. How come there are so many tafsirs? Does every mufassir have a different point of view or interpretation? Okay, well, number one, you saw an example with what we covered today about Surat al-Kawthar, that there is scope for difference of interpretation. In fact, we mentioned before that, this actually brings up a good point. We mentioned before that the Qur'an has verses that are muhkamat, verses that are clear and explicit and have no ambiguity in them. And then there are verses that have some degree of ambiguity, so they're open to interpretation. And we also mentioned that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al Imran, He discusses الَّذِينَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ زَيْغٌ, those who have some corruption in their hearts. They actually take verses that are ambiguous, and attempt to twist them according to their agendas. But because there is, in the language of the Qur'an, scope for difference of interpretation, not every difference of interpretation means that someone is trying to twist the Qur'an. There is a multiplicity of meanings that are possible. Sometimes one interpretation might be correct and another interpretation might be incorrect, but there's scope for different ijtihad. In some cases, the multiplicity of interpretation it could very well be, or multiplicity of meanings that can be taken could very well all be true. As we saw here with Al-Kawthar, one possible solution to the question of the tafsir of Al-Kawthar is to say that Al-Kawthar means a river in Jannah, but it also means Al-Khair al-Kathir in the general sense. And so therefore it encompasses both. Although there is the other view that says that no, Al-Kawthar here is referring specifically to this river in Jannah. But if you take the first approach, you find that what happens here is that there is a multiplicity in meanings. And each of those meanings can be correct. So because there is scope for difference in interpretation, either those different interpretations all being valid, or all, rather than with those different interpretations all being correct and complementing one another, or the difference in different interpretations not necessarily being all correct, but all being within the scope of what is a valid and plausible interpretation. So it's natural then that you will have different commentaries, and every mufassir will write his own tafsir. Another thing that we mentioned, and if you haven't listened to them, I would recommend that you actually go back and listen to the previous lessons, because it will give some insight on this, is that different tafsirs had different focuses. So there was a development of the tafsir literature going on. So as we mentioned, after Zamakhshari wrote his Al-Kashaf, tafsirs exploring the balagha, the eloquence of the language of the Qur'an, became a new focus in tafsir. And so you might find hints of this type of analysis, balaghi analysis, rhetorical analysis of the Qur'an, in earlier tafsirs. But after Zamakhshari, it becomes a major feature of the tafsir literature. But I think at the end of the day, suffice it to say that the Qur'an is so rich in meaning that there will always be meaning left to be discovered. And so the process of explaining the Qur'an will not end. Also at the same time, we are moving away from the time at which the Qur'an was revealed. But we're also moving away from the time period in which many of these tafsirs were written. And so if the Qur'an is intended to be guidance for all of mankind, and it's intended to be guidance for all generations of mankind until Yawm al-Qiyamah, with their various languages and backgrounds and cultures, various knowledge levels, various needs, there will always be a need to bring that explanation up to date. Up to date in the sense of making it accessible. Making it accessible, number one, by presenting it in a fashion that the contemporary reader will understand. Number two, as the nations of the earth have entered into Islam, there's a need to translate and present that message in the languages of the world. So in all of these fashions, this process of tafsir or writing tafsir will not and cannot come to an end, which brings me to a point that I wanted to mention and I neglected to mention. With regards to the average Muslim and his relationship to the Qur'an and tafsir and tadabbur, everyone can read the Qur'an. If you cannot read it in the original Arabic, you can read it in translation. Everyone can read the Qur'an, understand the Qur'an, but there is an element of tafsir that requires dependence on specialists, for which the tafsir literature that has been written by the scholars of this ummah, and we talked at great length over 2 lectures about, I should say we actually talked considerably we spoke very briefly in 2 lectures about a literature and scholarly efforts that span 1400 years. So I attempted, and I hope that to some degree or another I was successful in conveying to the listener an idea of the depth of scholarship that went into these commentaries. And in the verse in Surat Ali Imran, the verse that I alluded to earlier, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالَّذِي أَنزَلَ عَلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ مِنْهُ آيَاتٌ مُحْكَمَاتٌ هُنَّ أُمُّ الْكِتَابِ وَأُخْرَ مُتَشَابِهَاتٌ. He is the one who has revealed to you the book. It contains clear, explicit, unequivocal verses that are the foundation of the book, and other verses that have some ambiguity in them. فَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ زَيْغٌ فَيَتَّبِعُونَ مَا تَشَابَهَ مِنْهُ ابْتِغَاءَ الْفِتْنَةِ وَابْتِغَاءَ تَأْوِيلِهِ. As for those in whose hearts there is some corruption, they seek out the ambiguities, seeking to interpret them according to their own agendas, and seeking to cause doubt, to cause mischief. وابتغاء الفتنة وابتغاء تأويله وما يعلم تأويله إلا الله والراسخون في العلم. And none knows their interpretation other than Allah and the راسخون في العلم, those who are firmly grounded in knowledge. I think it goes without saying that at the top of this rank would be those who are the Imams of Tafsir, who have been the reference point of the Ummah for Tafsir, starting from the time of the Sahaba down until the modern era. So, وَالرَّاسِخُونَ فِي الْعِلْمِ يقولون آمنا به كل من عند ربنا وما يذكروا إلا أولو الألباب. They say, we believe in it, we believe in all of it. كل من عند ربنا. All of it is from our Lord. So we have to understand it as a comprehensive, cohesive whole. And this requires a person who is from الراسخين في العلم. And so this is why it's important then for the average Muslim, when it comes to issues of interpretation, to rely on this vast tafsir literature that has been written by great scholars for over 1400 years. So what I said at the beginning about a person developing his own moral compass means that you should be able to have instinctively an idea of what is right and wrong. It doesn't mean throw scholarship out the window, because even to read the Qur'an, if you don't know the Arabic language, to even read the Qur'an, you will read a translation. That translation was done by who? It was done by somebody who has consulted, to some extent or another, this vast, rich heritage of scholarship. So there's no getting around that as an average, that for the average Muslim, he will be dependent on the scholarship for understanding the Quran properly. So it's important then also for the average Muslim to have a connection to this scholarly tradition. But the connection to this scholarly tradition is not so that you can become a member of a cult. It's so that you can understand what Allah is trying to tell you. So yes, because you are in need of a specialist, you are referring to a specialist. Not because the specialist is, or quote unquote specialist, it has some sort of spiritual monopoly on guidance that you do whatever he says, you follow whatever he says. No, the standard is the Qur'an. The standard is the Qur'an and also the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But it's natural that a person who's not a specialist, for things that require specialist knowledge, would refer to a specialist. I mean, as an example, most of you here are doctors. Now, it might be true that the average person who is not a medical expert should have a basic level of knowledge and understanding of how to maintain good health, how to deal with certain types of illness. You wouldn't advise him, it would not be advisable for him to then, operate on himself and to medicate himself and to handle his medical affairs entirely independently without having the actual expertise to do so, simply because he's not an expert. And this doesn't mean that I'm therefore shutting my mind off and handing the keys to a doctor and saying, whatever you want to do, go ahead and do it. I'm still an individual with my own agency as an individual human being to make my own decisions. But as an intelligent human being, knowing that I have no expertise in this area, we'll try and read up on it, try and understand what's going on, and consult with experts and get expert opinion. And if I don't feel comfortable with one, I'll go to another and get a second opinion, third opinion, until I'm confident that I have, as best as my layman, untrained mind can determine, figured out what is most likely the problem here and what is the best way of dealing with it. Not because I'm an expert, but because I have to. And because I have to deal with this issue, where I know that I'm lacking the expertise, I have to rely on experts. This is in every walk of life. I mean, if you want to build a house, you will. If you're not an architect, you're not an engineer. You will consult an architect. You will consult an engineer. Nobody says that, who made these people priests of building buildings, because they have the expertise and you don't. So scholarship is the same way, that the person who is not a scholar of Islam, or not a scholar of Tafsir, not a scholar of the Qur'an, needs to rely on those who are. But at the same time, this doesn't mean just shutting your mind off. Because we'll conclude with that. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.